I have been asked on occasion what made me trust her. The question is usually put to me by men who want a strategic answer, who expect me to say something about reading character, or about the calculus of risk in an impossible situation, or about the particular intelligence required to identify, under pressure, the person least likely to betray you. Those men would understand that kind of answer. It would fit the shape of the life they imagine I lead. The true answer is that I did not trust her. I had no basis for trust and no time to establish one. I asked a woman I had never met to perform the role of my wife in front of a house full of people who would have been delighted to watch me fail. And I asked it in a gatehouse doorway, while the rain came sideways off the Atlantic. And she looked at me with the expression of someone who has been presented with a very strange problem, and is deciding, on practical rather than emotional grounds, whether it is manageable. That expression was what did it, I think, not trust, recognition. I will tell it from the beginning, because the beginning is the only honest place to start, and because I was not, in those 3 days at Trevane Head, anyone she should have said yes to. The house party was Lady Trevelyan's idea, as most catastrophes in that corner of Cornwall were. She was my nearest neighbor of any social consequence, the widow of a man who had owned the land directly east of my estate's boundary for 40 years, and she had spent the decade since his death engineering the social life of the Cornish coast with the cheerful relentlessness of a person who considers the management of other people's affairs both a vocation and a right. I had, over 12 years as Duke of Trevane, developed a workable policy regarding her invitations. Attend the smaller ones, where the guest lists were genuine and the dinners short. Avoid the larger ones, which were invariably organized around a purpose she had not disclosed in the invitation itself. I had made an error in August. The invitation had said 10 guests, there were 22. The invitation had said a week. 2 of the guests had apparently been invited for a fortnight, and one of them was Miss Alara Pending, the only surviving daughter of Lord Pending of Rostig, whose father had been systematically, over the past year, maneuvering the Pending family finances into a position where a connection with the Trevane estate would resolve several problems at once. I knew this because Pending was not subtle, and because the solicitor he had engaged to make preliminary inquiries had sent a letter that could only be described as optimistic. I had not responded to the letter. Miss Pending was 19, pleasant-faced, well-mannered, and entirely without fault except that her father wanted my estate, and she appeared to have accepted this as her assignment. She looked at me across the dinner table with the particular expression of a young woman who has been told that a thing is to happen and is preparing to be agreeable about it. I recognized the expression because I had worn a version of it myself, 12 years ago, on the occasion of my own first marriage. My wife Constance had been perfectly suited, by every measure the county understood, to the position of Duchess of Trevane. She had been well-born, well-educated, composed in company, and entirely indifferent to me as a man rather than as a title. We had managed the marriage with the mutual courtesy of 2 people who have agreed, without ever saying so, that what they have is a contract rather than a life, and she had died 4 years into it of a fever that had swept the coast one winter, and I had mourned her with the particular grief of someone who realizes, too late, how lonely they had been in a room with another person. I did not want to do it again. I did not, staring at Miss Pending across the fish course, have a clear plan for how to avoid it. Only the pressing certainty that I needed to leave Trevelyan House before Lord Pending's proximity converted pressure into an engagement I would have to unpick publicly, which would be expensive and unpleasant, and would make enemies I did not need in my own county. I decided on the 3rd evening to go. The storm that had been threatening since the previous morning broke at 4:30, which complicated things. The road from Trevelyan House to Trevane Head ran along the cliff top for the first mile, and was impassable in a storm of any real strength. I had lost 2 carriages to that road over the years, and my coachman Jennings was a sensible man who had, since the second loss, developed a firm policy about the clifftop road in bad weather. I told him we were leaving, and he said, in the careful voice he reserved for telling me things I would not like, that we could not take the cliff road until the wind dropped, which he estimated would be after midnight. Midnight was too late. Lord Pending had arranged. I had learned from Lady Trevelyan's housekeeper, who was not as discreet as she believed, a gathering in the drawing-room at 9, at which he intended to raise a toast that, in his imagining of events, would create the social conditions for a formal announcement. He was, I reflected, not a foolish man. He had maneuvered carefully and read the situation with some accuracy. But he had made the mistake of underestimating how far I was prepared to go to avoid a thing I had decided to avoid. The estate's gatehouse sat at the property's western edge, at the point where the lane from Trevelyan House joined the coast path that ran, less dangerously than the cliff road, down toward the harbor village of Penrith Cove. The gatehouse was used, in better weather, by the ground staff. In a storm, it was simply a small stone building with a serviceable roof and a latch that could be lifted from either side. I went there at 6, on foot in the rain, because it gave me somewhere to be that was not the drawing-room while I waited for midnight and the wind to drop. I was not in an excellent temper. She was already inside. She was sitting on the larger of the 2 boxes that served as the gatehouse's furniture, with a length of dark fabric across her lap and a needle and thread in her hands, working in the dim light that came through the single small window. She was perhaps 25, slight, with the kind of face that does not advertise itself, even-featured, clear-eyed, a fine spray of salt damp across her cheek from the walk up from the village, which told me she had come from Penrith Cove rather than from the house. Her dress was plain wool, dark, the dress of a working woman. The fabric in her lap appeared to be part of a gown, a considerably finer gown than anything she was wearing, and she was mending it with the focused competence of someone who had been doing this work for a long time. She looked up when I came in. She looked at me the way she would look at anything that required assessment, directly, without apology, with the quality of someone who has learned that the accurate reading of a situation is more useful than the polite one. "Your Grace," she said. She knew who I was then. Most people on this stretch of coast did. "You are using my estate's gatehouse," I said. It came out less graciously than I had intended. I was wet and cold and had been calculating and recalculating escape routes for 3 days, and I was not at my best. "I am, Your Grace." No apology. I came up from the village with a repair job for Lady Trevelyan's maid and got caught in the storm on the way back. I needed somewhere to finish the work before the light goes. I looked at the fabric in her lap. I looked at the window, which was giving her approximately enough light to see by, and would give her considerably less in another hour. "Who are you?" I asked. "Nell Hart," she said. "My mother keeps the seamstress shop in Penrith Cove. I do the housework." I stood in the doorway for a moment, calculating. The gatehouse was small. There was not, realistically, room enough for both of us to be comfortable, and I was wet and she was dry, and she was here first and had a reasonable purpose, while my purpose was the least dignified thing a duke had done in this county in recent memory, hiding in a gatehouse to avoid an engagement. I sat on the other box. She went back to her sewing. The rain came down. The Atlantic, which you could hear from the gatehouse as a continuous low argument with the cliff, seemed to be winning on points. I sat in the small dry space and thought about Lord Pending's toast and about 12 years of managing a life that had been built, very carefully, to look like everything it wasn't. And I said because I was tired and wet, and the small stone room had a quality of simplicity I had not been in the company of in a long time, and because she was sitting across from me without any agenda at all, simply sewing, simply being exactly what she was, I said, "Miss Hart, I am going to propose something to you that is entirely irregular. I want you to know before I do it that I am aware it is irregular, and that if you find it offensive, you are entirely within your rights to say so, and I will say nothing more about it. She set the needle against the fabric and looked at me. What is the proposal? I told her. I told her about the house party, about Lord Pending, about the engagement that was being prepared for me like a room that someone had furnished without consulting the person who was meant to live in it. I told her I needed to be somewhere other than that drawing room at 9 o'clock, and other than this house party for the next 2 days, and that the only way to achieve that without giving offense that would damage me in my own county was to have a reason that society would accept. I told her I needed a wife. Not a real one, I said, carefully. A wife for 3 days, for the purposes of the house party, which would explain my presence in the county without requiring me to be available for Lord Pending's toast, and which would give Lady Trevelyan a satisfactory explanation for my changed circumstances that she could share with the assembled guests. I told her I would pay her, a specific sum, enough to matter. I named it clearly because I did not want there to be any ambiguity about what kind of arrangement this was. She looked at me for a long moment after I finished, not with shock, with the particular attention she had, the measuring quality. You want me to pretend to be your wife, she said. For 3 days, in front of the house party. You would attend the dinners, perhaps a walk or two, be seen in my company. Lady Trevelyan's guests are not strangers to the area. Some of them will know you are not who you claim to be, or suspect it, but they will not say so because the social cost of being wrong is too high. By the time the truth becomes clear, Lord Pending's moment will have passed. And then it is over and you return to Penrith Cove and your mother's shop, and Lord Pending's solicitor sends another letter that I do not answer. She was quiet for a moment. The rain made its argument with the cliff. What is the sum? She said. I told her again. She looked at the gown in her lap, and I thought briefly about the fact that she was here at all, had walked up from the village to mend someone else's gown in a gatehouse during a storm, and about what the sum I had named represented to a woman who did that work. My mother owes a debt, she said, to the chandler. It has been owing for 3 months and he is not patient. She looked at me. The sum would cover it. It would, I said. 2 conditions, she said. I said nothing, which she took correctly as agreement to hear them. The first is that you tell me, exactly and in advance, whatever I need to know to avoid making an obvious error. I will not make a fool of myself in front of a roomful of people for something that could have been prevented by better information. Agreed, I said. The second is that when it is over, it is over. No continuing arrangement, no further claims on my time or my reputation. 3 days, then I go back to the village and this does not follow me. Agreed, I said. Those are reasonable conditions. She folded the repaired gown, set it in her basket, and picked up her needle and thread and put them away. She looked at me with a clear, direct expression. All right, she said. Where do we begin? We began in the gatehouse, with me explaining the guests, the social landscape, the specific pressure Lord Pending had been building, and the exact nature of what Lady Trevelyan's drawing-room gathering was intended to produce. Nellhart listened with the quality of someone who is memorizing, not merely hearing. She asked precise questions at precise moments, never for reassurance, only for information she needed and did not have. The Trevelyan woman, she said, does she know it is arranged, the engagement? She may suspect it. She is not an unintelligent woman, but she enjoys the social occasion as a thing in itself. The gathering matters to her apart from its purpose. If there is an alternative occasion, she will manage her disappointment. And if she asks how we met, I had not, I realized, prepared this. In Penrith Cove, I said, earlier in the summer, I was walking the coast path. Were you? I am often on the coast path. She considered this. That is at least true, she said. When did we marry? Quietly, a private ceremony in July, family only. What family? Mine is limited. My mother died 8 years ago. I have a cousin in Shropshire who would not contradict any account I gave. Then July, she said, a private ceremony. She seemed to file this. I don't know how to behave at a dinner like this. You know how to behave at a dinner, I said. Not at this kind of dinner. The rules are the same. Don't speak when others are speaking. Listen more than you talk. When in doubt, be brief. She looked at me with the expression that I would come to think of as her measuring look. You are describing how you behave, she said. I stopped. She was not wrong. Yes, I said, more or less. What am I supposed to say when someone asks me about our courtship? The truth as close as possible. We met on the coast path. I was struck by you. I called on you. You called on a seamstress in Penrith Cove, she said. With a note carried down by your man, I suppose. With a note, yes. And I found that sufficiently surprising and sufficiently worthwhile to say yes. You are a woman of independent judgment, I said. The measuring look again. I am going to need a gown, she said. I had thought of this. I told her that Lady Trevelyan's maid would likely have something that could be altered, and that the sum I was paying her was specifically designed to cover alterations as well as the debt. She nodded once and picked up her basket. Tonight's dinner is at 7:30, I said. I'll have Jennings bring you up from the gatehouse at 7. I'll be ready, she said. She said it with the certainty of a person who is always ready, and went out into the rain, and I sat in the gatehouse for a few minutes longer, looking at the empty box she had been sitting on and the small window through which the light had almost entirely gone, and I thought that I had made either the most sensible or the most reckless decision of the past 12 years, and could not, at that moment, determine which. The first dinner was the hardest thing I had watched her do, and she did it without flinching once. She appeared at my side at 7:30 in a gown that had clearly begun life as Lady Trevelyan's maid's second best, dark green silk, adjusted to her smaller frame with the expert speed of someone who had been adjusting gowns all her life. Her hair was arranged simply, no elaborate dressing, just pulled back and pinned with the 2 pearl pins she had brought in her pocket because, she had told me flatly at 7 o'clock, they were her mother's, and she was not going to a dinner without something of her own about her. She looked in the candle-lit hall of Trevelyan House, like what she was, a woman who was not accustomed to this world, and who had decided that the appropriate response to that fact was not to pretend otherwise but to be, simply and completely, herself. This was not what I had expected. I had expected her to be nervous. I had prepared in the carriage to cover for nervousness, to speak when she could not, to move the conversation when it drifted toward territory she couldn't navigate. She was not nervous. She was alert. There is a difference, and I saw it in the first 5 minutes, the slight forward tilt of attention when someone spoke to her, the moment before she answered in which she was not gathering herself but simply making sure she had heard accurately. Lady Trevelyan said when I introduced Nell as my wife, "My dear, what a surprise. We had no idea Sela's was, of course, we are so delighted." And Nell said, "It was a very quiet ceremony, Lady Trevelyan. We preferred it that way." And the "we" landed with such quiet certainty that Lady Trevelyan's eyebrows went up and she said, "Yes, I can quite understand that," and the subject turned. Lord Pending, at the far end of the table, said nothing at dinner. He had the expression of a man whose carefully laid plan has encountered an obstacle he had not anticipated, and who is deciding whether the obstacle can be removed or must simply be worked around. Miss Pending sat beside him with the same pleasant composure she always wore, and I felt, looking at her, a complicated pity. She had not chosen this any more than I had, and she was bearing it better. Nell, seated to my left, ate the fish course and then the joint, and then the pudding with the focused appreciation of someone who does not eat this well routinely, and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. She did not make conversation for the sake of it. When she was spoken to, she answered directly, and when she was not spoken to, she watched the table with the measuring quality she brought to everything. The woman to her left was a Mrs. Carn, no relation, the wife of a minor landowner from the eastern side of the county, a woman who had spent the previous 2 evenings being comprehensively ignored by most of the table, because her husband's land was too small, and her family too undistinguished to make her interesting. She had sat at dinner on those 2 evenings with the particular stillness of someone who has made their peace with being invisible. Nell noticed, I saw her notice. She turned during the gap between the fish and the joint and said something to Mrs. Carn. I did not hear it clearly, some question about the eastern county, the kind of direct question that requires a real answer rather than a social one. And Mrs. Carn's stillness dissolved into the relief of being genuinely asked something, and they talked, quietly, for most of the rest of dinner. I watched this happen. I watched Nell Hart, who had been paid to perform the role of my wife for 3 days, spend the dinner attending to the one person at the table who needed attending to, for no reason I could identify except that she had noticed, and it seemed to her like the appropriate thing to do. I said nothing. I talked to Lord Pending, who was managing his recalibration with the particular surface smoothness of a man who has not yet given up, and to the man on my right, who was visiting from London and wanted to talk about drainage legislation, and I said the right things to both of them and was not present in the room in any meaningful sense, because I was watching Nell Hart talk to Mrs. Carn and thinking about a word I did not usually apply to people I had known for less than 2 hours. The word was natural. She was entirely natural. Not naive, she was watching the table. She understood the social landscape with the accuracy of someone who had been observing it from outside for years, but unperformed. She was not arranging herself. She was simply there. I had not been simply there in a very long time. The second day was warmer. The storm had broken overnight, and the coast emerged into the kind of clear salt-blown morning that the Atlantic produces after it has exhausted itself. Lady Trevelyan organized a walk to the headland, which was the kind of thing Lady Trevelyan organized when she wanted people to pair off in ways she had arranged in advance. I was aware of this and found, walking beside Nell along the cliff path above the sea, that I did not particularly mind. She walked the way she did everything, with her full attention given to the thing she was actually doing, which was walking along a spectacular cliff above a brilliant Atlantic with the wind off the water and the gorse in flower at the path's edge. She was not performing the appreciation of it. She simply appreciated it in the way that people appreciate things they do not take for granted. "Do you walk this path?" I asked. "Not this section, too far from the village." She looked at the sea. "The path below Penrith Cove I walk most mornings when there's enough light. Before the work. Before the work." I thought about what that meant an hour before the day began, the cliff path, the sea, alone. I thought about my own mornings, which began with correspondence and ended with more correspondence, with the management of an estate that I was competent at and had no particular passion for. "Do you like the work?" I asked. It was not the kind of question I usually asked people. I was not entirely sure why I was asking it. She considered it as she considered everything actually, rather than reflexively. "I like the precision of it," she said. "There is a right way and a wrong way, and the difference is visible." She paused. "I don't particularly like the households. Some of the women are unkind about the shop. They use us because we're good and then treat us as though needing a seamstress is an embarrassing necessity." "Are they unkind to you personally?" "Sometimes. I don't mind it very much." She looked at the sea again. "I mind when they're unkind to my mother. She worked very hard to build the shop and she's good at it, and some of the same women who have been wearing her gowns for 20 years treat her as though she ought to be grateful for the condescension." A pause. "That I mind." I looked at her profile against the sea and the sky, and I thought about what it would be like to be the kind of person who minded things on behalf of other people more readily than on their own behalf. And I found I did not have a very clear picture of it from the inside. "Who is the Chandler?" I asked. "The one your mother owes?" She looked at me briefly. "Varco. He's not a bad man, just a man with a business to run. My father borrowed from him before he died, and my mother has been managing it since." She said it plainly, with the accuracy of someone who has stopped finding the fact painful and simply carries it. "How long has your father been dead?" 8 years. I calculated. That meant she had been 17. Old enough to understand what the debt meant, young enough for it to have shaped everything since. "I am sorry," I said. She looked at me with the expression that I was beginning to understand was her version of receiving something, direct, without performance, simply accepting it as meant. "Thank you," she said. Behind us, somewhere along the cliff path, Lady Trevelyan was talking to Lord Pending in the carrying voice she used when she wanted people to know she was managing a situation. I could not hear the words clearly. I did not, in that moment, particularly care. "My wife died 4 years ago," I said. I had not planned to say it. The cliff path was doing something to my usual restraint. It was a practical arrangement. We were both aware of that. I was not, I think, what she wanted, and she was not. I don't know what I wanted exactly, but it was not what we had. I stopped. "I am not saying this for sympathy. I am saying it because you told me something true, and I found I wanted to say something true back." She was quiet for a moment. "Was she unhappy?" she said. "I think she was lonely," I said. "I think we both were in the same house for 4 years, and I did not know how to fix it, and I suspect she did not either, and neither of us said so. And then she was gone, and I have thought about it ever since." Nell looked at the sea. The wind was picking up again, not a storm, just the ordinary argument, and her hair was loosening from its pins at the edges, the way it did when she was outdoors. "That is a sad thing," she said. "Not tragic, just sad. The kind of sad that is made of small missed moments rather than one large one." I looked at her. "Yes," I said. "Exactly that." We walked back along the cliff in the wind, and Lady Trevelyan reorganized her party into groups for luncheon, and Lord Pending sat across from me at the table with the expression of a man making one more calculation, and Miss Pending was as pleasant and composed as she had been every day, and I talked about drainage legislation again with the London man, and Nell sat beside me and ate her luncheon and said very little, and once, when I said something that was not quite accurate, put her hand briefly on my arm, the lightest possible contact, and said, "That was June, wasn't it?" And I said, "June, yes," and her hand was gone, but I was aware for the rest of the meal of the exact location of my arm. The second evening was when it began to unravel. Not through any fault of Nell's. Through the arrival, unexpected and uninvited, Lady Trevelyan would explain afterward that she had simply appeared at the door, which was technically true, of a woman named Mrs. Vella Petherick, who was the widow of the man who had managed my father's finances for 22 years, and who had known me since I was 11 years old. She was 73, sharp-eyed, and entirely without the social inhibition that most people develop as a protective mechanism. She came in during the evening's gathering, cards and conversation, the kind of evening that Lady Trevelyan organized when she wanted information she could not get at dinner. And she looked at me, and she looked at Nell, and she said, in the voice she reserved for things she found interesting, "Sela's." "Who is this? She's not Constance." "Mrs. Petherick," I said. "My wife, Nell." Mrs. Petherick looked at Nell with the specific attention of a woman who has been reading people for 7 decades. "Where are you from, girl?" "Penrith Cove," Nell said without hesitation. "Hart's shop, Dorothy Hart's girl." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Petherick turned to me with the expression of someone who has just solved a puzzle she was not aware she had been working on. "Dorothy Hart's girl," she said, and then in a lower voice, "Is this real Sela's?" I looked at her. I thought about 12 years of managing surfaces, and about a cliff path in the morning light, and about a hand on my arm that had lasted 3 seconds and taken the rest of the afternoon to stop feeling. "I don't know yet," I said. It was the truest thing I had said in a very long time, and Mrs. Petherick looked at me with the expression that had always, since I was 11, made me feel like she could see directly through whatever I was doing to the person underneath it, and she said, "Well, find out before you lose her then," and went to find the card tables. I stood with this for a moment. Then I went to find Nell, who was standing near the window with a glass of something, and looking out at the dark coast in the direction of Penrith Cove. "Who was that?" she asked. "A woman who has known me a long time," I said. "She is very perceptive." "What did she say to you?" I looked at her profile against the window. "She told me to find out whether this is real before I lose you." Nell turned and looked at me. The measuring quality, the full direct attention. "We have 1 day left," she said. "I know. After which I go back to Penrith Cove, and your solicitor sends Lord Pending a letter, and this is over." "That was the agreement," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she looked back out at the dark sea and said, "I think we should go back to the party." And we did, and I spent the rest of the evening playing cards very badly for the first time in 12 years. The third day, the exposure came at noon. I had not anticipated it from Lord Pending, who was managing his recalibration with more grace than I had expected. It came from his solicitor, a man named Trethwy, who had driven up from Penzance that morning, apparently at Pending's summons, though Pending himself appeared to have had no idea what Trethwy intended, and who produced, at the luncheon table, a document. Not a legal document, a letter. From a woman in Penrith Cove who had done work for Trethwy's household, who had mentioned, in passing, that Dorothy Hart's daughter had gone up to Trevelyan House to do an alteration job and had not come back, and who had understood from the village that she was still there, in some capacity she couldn't quite account for. Trethwy read this letter aloud. He did it with the practiced precision of a man who has built a career on the deployment of inconvenient information at moments of maximum social effect. The table was quiet. I looked at Nell. She was looking at the table. Her hands were in her lap, not visible, and her face was, the word that came to me, which surprised me, was composed. Not pale, not stricken, simply the familiar quality of someone who has been presented with a hard fact and is determining on practical grounds what the appropriate response is. She looked up, she looked at Trethwy, and she said in the clearest, most even voice, "The letter is accurate. I came up from Penrith Cove to do an alteration job 3 days ago. I met the Duke during the storm and he asked me to stay. I agreed. I am a seamstress from the village." She paused. "I am also his wife. Both things are true." The table remained quiet. Lord Pending, I saw, was looking at his plate. Lady Trevelyan was looking at me. Mrs. Petherick was looking at Nell with an expression that, on a 73-year-old woman, I had not seen before and could only describe as delight. I said, "Miss Hart and I met under unconventional circumstances and married privately. I did not announce it publicly because it was not the county's business. It is still not the county's business." I looked at Trethwy. Solicitors who produce private correspondence at luncheon tables should perhaps reflect on the professional implications. Trethwy looked as though he was reconsidering his approach. This was appropriate. But Nell was already pushing back her chair. She said it quietly to me while the table was reorganizing itself around Trethwy's retreat. "I think I should go now." Not angrily. The way she said everything accurately. "The agreement was 3 days. This is the 3rd day. I think it's time." I looked at her. She had picked up the small bag she had been carrying for 3 days, the seamstress's bag, the one with the pearl pins in it and the needle and thread, and she was looking at me with the measuring expression, and behind it, for the first time, something that was not quite the composed equanimity I had been watching for 3 days. something quieter and more private. "Nell," I said. "I'll walk back down the cliff path," she said. "Thank you for the arrangement." She said it neutrally, without irony, without reproach. The same tone she had used to tell me about the Chandler. The same tone she had used to say, "We preferred it that way," to Lady Trevelyan 3 nights ago. Simply accurate. She left. I sat at the table for 6 hours. I ate nothing. I talked to no one. Lady Trevelyan tried 3 times and I said the same thing each time, which was, "I am quite all right, Lady Trevelyan, thank you," which was not accurate but which she accepted because there was no other option. Lord Pending left with Miss Pending in the afternoon, with the smoothness of a man executing a graceful retreat. Mrs. Petherick sat across the drawing-room from me all afternoon and said nothing, which was, from her, a form of kindness. At 6 o'clock she said, "Are you going to go, or are you going to sit here?" She had the right of it, I said. The agreement was 3 days. "Yes," she said. And then she left, and it has been 6 hours, and you look like a man who has just realized what he has lost, which is the relevant piece of information. I looked at her. "I don't know how to do this," I said. "I have managed everything badly for 12 years. I don't know how to go down there and say a true thing and have it mean what I intend it to mean." "You managed 3 days rather well," Mrs. Petherick said. "So I understand from Lady Trevelyan, who is a more accurate observer than she appears, and from Mrs. Carne, who said your wife was the kindest person at the table." She looked at me with the 7-decade eyes. "Go, Silas." I went. The cliff path in the dark was not the cliff path in the morning light. It was steeper and narrower feeling, with the sea invisible below and audible everywhere. The low, persistent argument of the Atlantic, which has been making that argument against that particular stretch of cliff since before anyone in Penrith Cove was born, and will be making it long after everyone alive is gone. I walked it with a lantern and no plan except the word that kept coming to me, which was simply her name. The village was small and late, most of its windows dark. The seamstress shop was at the harbor end of the main street. I knew it because I had walked past it on a dozen occasions without ever going in, which now struck me as one of the longer list of things I had managed to fail at without realizing. There was a light in the back room. I knocked on the door. Nell opened it after a moment. She was still in the dark green gown. She had not yet had time to change, or perhaps she had not yet thought about it. She looked at me with the measuring expression and then, after a moment, stepped back from the door. I went in. The shop was small, tidy, full of the evidence of work, fabric on shelves, a cutting table, 2 dress forms in the corner. A woman who had to be Dorothy Hart was seated at the back table, pretending to read something she was not reading, and she looked up at me with the expression of a woman who has been told something and is now seeing the thing itself and finding it stranger than expected. "Mrs. Hart," I said. "Your Grace," she said. She stood because one stands for a duke, and Nell said, "Mama, could you?" And Dorothy Hart said, "Yes, quite," and left with the seamless discretion of a woman who has raised a sensible daughter and knows when not to be in a room. Nell and I stood in the shop. The dress forms watched us neutrally. "I don't have a speech," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I came down the cliff path because I could not sit in Lady Trevelyan's drawing room any longer, and I need to say something true, and I don't have the words for it arranged yet." She looked at me, the measuring look. "What is the true thing?" she said. I looked at the shop. I looked at the dress forms and the shelves and the cutting table and the work that was this woman's life, which was a real life made of precise and honest things, and I looked at her in the dark green gown with the pearl pins still in her hair. "The true thing," I said, "is that I have been managing a life for 12 years that was very well organized and entirely empty, and I did not know it until I sat in a gatehouse with you for 40 minutes in a storm. And I know that what I am saying is not a reasonable thing. We have known each other 3 days, but you said the agreement was 3 days and you were right, and you left without reproach, and I have spent 6 hours in a drawing room realizing that the problem is not the agreement. The problem is that I do not want it to end." She was quiet. "I don't want the performance of a marriage," I said. "I had that and it was very lonely and I won't do it again. I want the real thing or I want nothing. I want to call on Dorothy Hart's daughter at the seamstress shop in Penrith Cove and be told to sit down and given something truthful to think about, and then perhaps be allowed to walk the cliff path in the morning and back again in the evening, for as long as she will permit it, until I have earned the right to say the rest of this." Nell looked at me for a long time. The lamp on the cutting table made the shadow long and the room small, and the dress forms were very quiet, and the sea was doing its usual thing with the cliff, the low argument, and I stood in Dorothy Hart's seamstress shop and waited. "That is a great deal to say to someone you have known for 3 days, she said. "I know. I have conditions," she said. "I will always have conditions. I told you that at the beginning." "You did. I found them reasonable at the beginning, and I expect they will continue to be reasonable." She looked at me with the expression that was not the measuring look and not the composed equanimity, the expression I had seen once, briefly, at the window of Trevelyan House when she was looking out at the dark sea in the direction of home. The private one. "You may call," she said, "on Dorothy Hart's daughter, at the shop, and we will walk the cliff path and you may talk to me, actually talk to me, the way you talked on the path yesterday, and then we will see." "We will see," I said. "Yes," she said, "we will see." I said good night. I went back up the cliff path in the dark with the lantern and the sea's argument and the feeling of a man who has, for the first time in a very long time, said a true thing and had it received as such, and found that the world does not, in fact, end when you do. We were married in December, in the church at Penrith Cove, which is small and old and smells of candle wax and the sea, which comes in under the door on the worst days because it comes in everywhere along that coast. Dorothy Hart sat in the front pew and wept with the satisfaction of a woman whose daughter has made a decision that required no management at all because the daughter had managed it herself. Mrs. Petherick attended and brought the look of quiet triumph she had been preparing since August, I suspect. Mrs. Carnes sent a letter. The cliff path I still walk most mornings. Most mornings she walks it with me, and on the mornings she does not, the shop has not closed, she has not stopped working. She will not stop working, and I have not asked her to. I walk it alone and think about the morning she walked it years before I knew her. Alone, before the work, in whatever light there was, attending to the thing she was actually doing. She was the only person I ever met who was precisely, completely, unfailingly herself. Not because she was incapable of performance. She had demonstrated, quite ably, that she could manage a drawing room and a dinner and 3 days in a house full of people who were watching her carefully and looking for a reason to doubt. She had chosen not to perform, for me, from the beginning. In the gatehouse, in the first 40 minutes, she had simply been what she was, a woman with a needle and thread and a practical intelligence and a mother's debt, and a walk she took each morning for reasons she had never had to explain to anyone before me. I had asked her once, sometime in the winter before the wedding, one of the cliff path mornings when the sea was flat for once and the light was the pale January kind, what she had thought that first evening when I made the proposition in the gatehouse. She had considered it with the usual quality. "I thought you were desperate," she said, "and desperate men make bad plans generally." But the plan itself was not unreasonable. There was a clear transaction, clear terms, clear conditions. I understood the shape of it. And that was enough. She looked at me. "That was the beginning of enough," she said. "The rest of it came after." "What was the rest of it?" "That you were lonely," she said simply. "I could see it in the first 5 minutes. And I have a practical way of thinking about things, and the practical thought was, Here is a man in a great deal of difficulty who needs help and is asking for it straightforwardly, which is more than most men in his position would do. She paused. And then on the cliff path the second day you told me about your wife and what you said was true, and you knew it was true, and you said it to me because I had said something true first. She looked at the sea. I don't meet many people who do that. I thought about 12 years of managing the surface of things, and about the gatehouse and the 40 minutes, and the needle and thread, and the pearl pins and the word, lonely, spoken on a cliff path. Nor do I said. She put her hand through my arm in the way she had taken to doing on the cliff path. Not for warmth, we were warm enough, just because it was what she did, and we walked on. And the sea made its argument with the cliff, the old continuous argument, and I was in no position to contradict it because I was there, and she was there, and neither of us was performing anything at all. That is what I mean when I say I did not trust her. I did not trust her, I recognized her. And in a life built very carefully on the management of every surface, recognition was the one thing I had no defense against and no desire to build one.